Hi all. In my previous video lecture, I talked about what myth is, that term, that slippery term. So now we're going to get more into what Greek mythology is all about, just getting into some background stuff. So in the previous lecture, I talked about I left you with three important ideas, right? Myths are stories about important things. Myths are part of an oral tradition, and there are many ways to interpret myths. And so we're going to dig into some more of these ideas as it pertains to Greek mythology in particular. And let me just say before I begin, mostly the information from these slides is taken from the reading that I've given you this week. It's chapter 1 from a textbook that I used in my face-to-face class. It's a good introduction to myth. When you're reading it, you don't need to read every single word and memorize everything. Read through it, look for the important ideas. I'm going to touch on a lot of them here. Do read through it. You can read through it quickly. I know it's like 30 pages. It's week 1, so don't worry about it too much. You can always return to it as well. So it's a kind of a good overall introduction to the course and to the idea of Greek mythology. So let's go through some ideas. In this little lecture, I'm going to talk about history, how we talk about ancient Greek history. I'm going to talk about some of the sources of Greek myth. I'm going to talk a little bit about Greek life as we understand it from archaeological and written records, and think a little bit about the function of myth in Greek society and culture. So archaeologists break down ancient Greek history into these time periods using archaeological records. Remember, this is just an arbitrary system. This is agreed on by all archaeologists who study the time period in the area. But it's not like in 1600 BCE people said, "Oh, I guess we're part of a new era," right? This is just our way of demarcating this ancient period using the records that we found. So just a note to begin with, BC or BCE, AD or CE. These are terms you'll see tossed around the reading. I think in the reading I've given you, they use BC, which means before the Christian era. Well, before Christ it means. I prefer BCE, which is before the Christian era. So it's a little less tied to the Christian faith. If you don't have BC. BC just seems to be a little more. It's about Christ, right? Whereas we're talking about the Christian era. Anyways, it's just a different terminology. I wanted to clear that up. They mean the same thing, BC and BCE. BCE is just maybe a more contemporary term. Okay, so the timeline we'll use, we're going back to 3000 BCE, so 3,000 years before before the birth of Christ, and as reported in the Bible. So we start with the Mycenaean Age, then the Mycenaean Age, the Dark Ages, or the Iron Age it's called sometimes, the Archaic Period, the Classical Period, the Hellenistic Period, then we're getting to Republican Rome and Imperial Rome. So we're going to concentrate on the first 5. We're not really getting into the last 3. We won't read any text from the last 3. We're looking at older stuff, right? We're not getting into Roman mythology this semester. Too bad, right? Okay, so let's go back to the Mycenaean Age. This is early ancient Greek, 3000 to 1600 BCE. It was perhaps, the records are kind of foggy and contradictory about who actually coined the name for this age. Some people argue it was a famous archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans, and he was naming this age after the mythical or legendary, remember we were talking about that last time, King Minos, or Minos, however you want to pronounce it. You can pronounce it both ways. So the Mycenaean Age was a sophisticated culture centered on Crete, the island of Crete, and you can find some book on page 34. There's not a lot known about this record. There's no written records, right? We have just some frescoes and pottery, some ruins, right? So this is going back a long way to very unpreserved things, but there are some beautiful frescoes and pieces of pottery, like we'll see in the next slide, that have been preserved. And there's mention of Minoan traders and rulers in the records of other civilizations, so we know that they were a powerful seagoing culture in the time, right? We have Egyptian hieroglyphics mentioning them. There are other cultures that mention them in their records as well. And what that means is that they got around and they made such an impact that other cultures wrote about them and recorded things about them, which suggests that they were powerful and prosperous and held a kind of powerful position within the area. So 2 things to think about as we move forward. In the artifacts that we have of Minoan culture, bulls play a very important role. Bull jumping was apparently a big ritual where young men and women would jump over bulls, kind of like bullfighting, but showing your bravery and all that kind of stuff, and a very much tied to fertility and that kind of stuff. And there's also the importance of the female divine in Minoan artifacts. There's a lot of figures like this of powerful women holding snakes, right, bare-breasted, this powerful kind of aggressive woman figure, right? So you have both of these things going on in some of the artifacts we found, and both of these are definitely echoed in a lot of later Greek myths and figures. So we move on to the Mycenaean Age, right? So it's an Indo-European, so we think that people came into the area around 1650. They controlled fortified cities on the Greek mainland, and it seems the records suggest that they, conquered the Cretians, the island of Crete. So they had these fortified cities, which suggests a much more warlike kind of conqueror society, right? You don't have fortresses unless you need them, right? Because they take a lot of effort to build. There aren't that many fortresses found on the island of Crete as compared to the Mycenaeans on the mainland. We have much more archaeological evidence. Obviously, they're a much more recent culture. But even then, we don't have too many written records. The writing that we have, which I'll show you on the next slide, is much more basic than later Greek writing. What else was I going to say? The Mycenaean Age is very interesting for us, especially because most of the heroes of mythology that we read about, Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, Jason, the fall of Troy, they're all associated with this period, the Mycenaean Age, right? So as we get later, and we're going to see this in the Archaic Period, the writers are looking backwards to this period, the Mycenaean Age, for their heroes, right? This is this mythological age of heroes. They don't really write so much about the Minoan, the people of the Minoan era. It's all the Mycenaean Age, and this is a very important age for the kind of spread of Greek culture at the time. And there's the importance of the male sky god takes over as the kind of lead god in the pantheon, right? Before in the Minoan Age, there's much more of the female divine. By the time we get to the Mycenaean Age, the record suggests that the kind of proto figure of Zeus, right, their sky god figure, has become the kind of head of that pantheon. That takes us to, I'm just going to show you an example. This is Mycenaean writing, so it's a kind of cuneiform, which means it was, writing impressed on wet clay. So this would be a clay tablet. While the clay was wet, people would press in the figures, right? It's like ancient Babylonian or Sumerian writing as well. Is done in a similar way, right? It's called cuneiform. This takes us to the Dark Age. So this is where things get really foggy. We don't have any written records of what happened, but the Mycenaean civilization seems to have disappeared for one reason or another. Excuse me. There are some big theories about what happened. Invaders came and conquered them and destroyed many of their cities, sacked their cities, left them in ruins, and they weren't able to bounce back from it. Internal strife. So it was it seems to be an aggressive culture, right? They had a lot of fortresses. It seems like that was part of their culture, but they were also not unified. There was no central commander. It was all city-states, right, and small armies. So maybe they fought each other and tore themselves apart. That's one theory. Or natural disaster. There's some records that suggest that floods and earthquakes and volcanoes, especially the volcano theory, led to the end of their civilization. But whatever happened, we have this period from 1100 BCE to 750 BCE where we don't have any written records. We don't have any cultural artifacts left, or nothing really impressive of a central powerful culture such as the Mycenaeans or the Minoans. The archaeological evidence we have suggests turmoil and isolation, right? There's a lack of written records. We have I don't think we have any written records from the era, right? And here's just an example of some pottery. This is from the Dark Ages, and this is from later during the classical and I think it's from the classical period. But you can see here, the pottery is very simple. The geometric symbols, just very simple pottery as compared to this. And the other thing too is, I could show you examples of different pottery from different areas, and they're all using different patterns. It's all very simple geometric stuff, very easy pottery to make, so it's suggesting a not very advanced pottery manufacturing industry. But they're all different patterns, which suggest isolation because they're not using a kind of centralized aesthetic, right? As compared to this, this was widespread. You could find similar things all throughout the Greek Empire once we get to the classical period. And you can see the difference in quality. This is a beautiful piece of pottery, is very advanced, figures, glaze, all this stuff going on versus this very simple geometric pattern. Okay, so you can see that's the kind of records that they've found to suggest in the Dark Ages this isolation and kind of falling back in lack of technology. Okay, and then that takes us to what we call the Archaic period. Archaic just comes from the Greek word which means old, right? So this is what we call the Old Period. So this is when we have a kind of reemergence of the Greek civilization. We have a network of independent city-states, which they call the polis, developing and becoming what we would think of as Greek culture. Eventually, there are over 1,000 city-states, right? Remember, this is an important part of the culture. Ancient Greek was not like a unified country. Unified countries didn't come around until much later, much later, like the 1600s and beyond, right? Before that, city-states were the norm, where a city would have a certain amount of power in the surrounding area until it got to the border of that. Then there would be another city-state, right? Sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't. But they were the Greek city-states were kind of a loose confederation of city-states. This is where we get the development of the Greek alphabet. So we saw that cuneiform version earlier, linear B as they call it. But now we get a much more definable alphabet. The development of these city-states led to different identities, right? Different city-states worshipped and emphasized different gods and goddesses, which is important. The different regions believed in or emphasized different gods and goddesses. We have the pre-Socratic philosophers, so the beginning of what we think of as ancient Greek philosophy is starting to develop. And two of the important writers, which we'll look at, Homer and Hesiod, were writing around this or during this period. And again, it's fuzzy. We don't know exactly when they were writing. We don't have too much details on either one of them, especially Homer. We know a little bit more about Hesiod, we think. But it's still very fuzzy. But we know they were writing in this period. But even what they're writing, as I mentioned in my last lecture, what they're writing is not unique to their minds. They're just telling stories that are popular, and this is their version. Okay, so this is an example of the Greek alphabet from the Archaic period, right? You can see the difference between this and the cuneiform I showed you earlier. The cuneiform earlier seemed to be like half letters and half hieroglyphics, images to represent ideas. And this seems to be all letters, right? Okay, so that takes us to the Classical period. So the Classical period, we have a much more advanced Greek society. The polises have developed this network, and they are more or less unified. And during this period, we have Persia trying to invade the Greek lands, and this leads to further unification of the Greek city-states. Right, they have to band together to defend themselves from the Persian armies. So Athens forms this league to defend themselves, which is a much more aligned and affiliated group of city-states. Then they, pledge to help protect each other and engage in trade and this kind of thing. And as a result, Athens becomes a cultural center during this period. We have a bunch of infighting. Sparta defeats Athens, Thebes defeats Sparta. There's a bunch of fighting back and forth. But regardless of that, as Athens does become this cultural center with this giant Dionysian festival, which leads to what we think of as the flowering of Greek drama, right? The Greek playwrights, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides are writing during this period, as well as the comedians. We have Socrates and Aristotle coming out of this place, coming out of Athens, right? This is also the period of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle, so you have this great chain, Socrates to Plato to Aristotle to Alexander the Great. I mean, he's Macedonian, but he was taught by Aristotle. Anyways, he leads he rallies the Greeks, first conquers them, but then rallies the Greeks and goes on his conquest, takes over much of the ancient world. Okay, and I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'll pick this up in part 2. Thank you very much.